Good morning and welcome to the ITEEA International presentation. Well, at least it's good morning for me. I suspect the audience today are in many different time zones, but wherever you are, welcome. I'd like to thank the ITEEA and PAT organisers for the invitation to present today. I jumped at the offer when it was first made because I hadn't visited Denver before and I was interested in doing that. However, as we all know, it didn't work out that way. Hopefully next year we can all meet face to face. So let me just share my screen and we'll get into the presentation. Okay, so I've been asked to look at the international applicability of the standards for technological and engineering literacy. So I'll do that in a number of ways as we go through the presentation. First of all, a little bit of background about the international aspects of ITEEA. It only changed its name in 1985 from the American Association to an international association. And there have been a number of mechanisms it has used since then to develop its international applicability. There's been a number of surveys of professional needs that have been done. As you know, the conference hosts the PAT and is a member of the International Conference for Technology Education in the Asia Pacific that encompasses 7 Asia Pacific countries. The association publishes the PAT proceedings, which is a great resource for researchers. There are a number of listservs which are international. There's members in over 45 countries, and there are international STEM centres in 21 countries. So there's quite an international focus for the association. In terms of the standards themselves, in 1994, the Standards for All Americans project was begun. That resulted in 2000, the Standards for Technological Literacy being published. The Advanced Excellence document in 2003, and then in 2020, there was felt to be a need to revise the standards. So in 2021, we have the Standards for Technological and Engineering Literacy. And these, of course, have been devised by teachers, supervisors, teacher educators, and disciplinary representatives. So in terms of thinking about the international applicability of the standards, there's a couple of questions I'd like to ask, and I'll work through these as we go through the presentations. First of all, what do the standards themselves state in terms of their international application? How have they been used in the past, and how might they be used in the future? And then I'll conclude with some questions to consider about the conceptions of how the standards are used according to some particular philosophical frameworks. So that's the approach I intend to follow. So first of all, what do the standards themselves state about their international applicability? Now, this is both implied and direct. So a number of my interpretations of the standards, I think, imply an application to internationality, and other statements are more direct. So if we look at these first 2 statements, first of all, technology for all through developing technological literacy is a strong theme throughout all the standards, and design-based learning through inquiry, critical thinking, and making and doing is emphasised as well. I mention these because these are themes which are internationally common and they apply to many countries. So in that sense, there's significant relevance there. The consideration of social, ethical, economic, environmental, and aesthetic factors. That's a statement in the preface, but you can see that coming through in the explication of the standards. And that particular consideration, of course, is an important focus for technology education also. One of the statements I found interesting on page 9 of the preface, it's up to others to develop curricula in ways that make sense for particular educational settings. I think that's particularly significant in an international context. And the following statement on the same page, this allows for local emphases and variations, a foundation upon which educators can build curricular approaches and assessments and design learning environments. So all of that implies an access and an applicability to the international context. So there's no grand unsupported claims of global applicability, as there have been in the past. So I mention that because it was a feature of previous curriculum developments in America. However, on page 9, it states that the standards apply regardless of where students live or their future goals. So I'm not sure about that statement in terms of the context that's being presented of its applicability, but we'll come back to that later. What do the standards say about how to use them? There's an emphasis on process and action, including designing and making. So that's another common theme throughout many international curricula. On page 2, it makes the point that literacy is a fluid construct and technology is constantly evolving on page 6. So you have this context of fluidity, evolution, nothing's set, but it can change and it can evolve, which is particularly useful, I think, for international communities. However, it goes on to state the standards focus on essential knowledge which defines an expected level or literacy. It provides a comprehensive structure that details the elements of technological and engineering literacy for all, regardless of where they live or their future goals. So this seems to be a little more deterministic. The level of literacy is defined, there's a comprehensive structure, and it's relevant regardless of where someone lives. So I think there's a little bit of an internal dichotomy there, which we'll come back to later. Okay, as you know, this is the summary of the standards, which is included in the standards themselves. The standards, practices, and context. And each of these areas are represented by a hexagon. Let's just look at each of those quickly in terms of their international applicability. So first of all, the standards. The document calls these 8 standards content standards and discipline standards in other places. It doesn't say content and discipline, but it describes them in some places as content standards, some places as discipline standards. I think that might be a little ambiguous for an international audience. Is it implying that these are prescriptive? Maybe if they're discipline standards, then or content standards, then they could be prescriptive. If they're more discipline standards, then maybe they're descriptive of the discipline. So in one sense, this prescriptiveness of these standards could be open to interpretation. In terms of the practices, I think the practices are quite generally applicable to many different international contexts. These 8 elements are elements that all students many students in many countries go through. It's very hard to be comprehensive in this case. So we look at these other terms, which are important practices: planning, researching, evaluating, identifying problems, testing, ideation, modelling, documenting. Many international curricula talk about these elements as the practices of technology as well. So the practices, I think, are fine. They're not comprehensive, but in a sense, that's not a critique, because it would be quite difficult to be entirely comprehensive. From an international applicability perspective, you think of a curriculum, for example, one of the curriculum in the UK, which focuses on identifying problems, or another curriculum in New Zealand, for example, which has a real focus on modelling. Then the application of these practices to those curriculum may be less because of that emphasis. Then finally, if we look at the 8 contexts, the question arises, are these comprehensive? And I think, again, it's quite difficult to be comprehensive. But in this context, I thought about the context within which I have been involved in technology curriculum development. For example, mud brick production in Botswana, thatching in Zimbabwe. These are all elements of technology curricula. Cooking stove design in Kenya. The development of the national curriculum in Seychelles included fishing. I think about Australia, the issues of sustainable sanitation in Central Australia, which is a design problem that many people have approached. And so thinking about those contexts in terms of the standards context, I can see where they fit. So the headings of the context and the descriptions of the context are quite broad, and I think generally are quite comprehensive. So to my next 2 questions about the international applicability of the standards, how have they been used in the past, and how might they be used in the future? So one way of answering those questions was to talk to the ITEEA STEM International Centres. And there's 21 of these around the world, and these are approximately where they are located. So I sent a few survey questions to each of the centres, and I've just selected responses from some of them to provide an indication of how the standards might be used from a user perspective in a range of different countries. Interestingly, it was these countries in which the standards were translated to their local language. So Germany, Estonia, Norway, Cyprus, Taiwan, and under my picture is Japan. I'm sorry about that, Japan. So these countries all translated the standards for technology education, not the more recent, of course. There hasn't been time for that yet, but not the more recent standards. So it was interesting to ask them about how they were using the standards. So if I look at the Netherlands first, the Netherlands used the STL in teacher education programs in their own curriculum revision, and it's anticipated in the Netherlands that the new standards will have a similar role and will be used in teacher training programs as a resource. So the comment from the Netherlands was that STEL incorporates some new insights that have been developed since the old standards came out. And in that respect, they are worth sharing with the next generation of teachers. The next country I inquired about was Finland. And in Finland, the original standards were translated and they were used in the context of a range of technology stakeholders as a source of ideas for teachers, and they were referenced at universities in teacher training contexts. There's a potential conflict with Finland and other Scandinavian countries which have a very strong craft history. So there's a feeling that the nature of the US standards, the STL, may not fit well for that reason. But nevertheless, Finland anticipates continuing to use the standards. Information about the standards will be spread through the blog and through the magazine. Then I asked Taiwan what their context is in terms of the standards. They used STL as a resource for their national curriculum development, and they anticipate that the standards for technology and engineering literacy will be used in similar ways. And they have quite an alignment with their curriculum and the technology and engineering aspect of the US standards. So the new standards shifted their core to the TE in STEM. This shift fits our policy to prepare more technologists and more engineers as teachers. So there's quite a lot of synergy there for Taiwan. New Zealand used these standards for technological literacy for research purposes. They had links on their professional association website, and their feeling was that the new standards will provide a good reference point, both for research and for teacher training. Cyprus was the next country I looked at. Cyprus actually developed some instructional support for STL and developed material for teachers based on the standards. So this is one country where the standards for technological literacy were used quite extensively. They estimated that at least 25% of the teachers were aware of the standards and they were translated into Greek. They anticipate that they will also translate the standards for technological and engineering literacy. And a comment was Cyprus utilises the Maryland plan and the alignment that the standards provided was a perfect fit. The new standard should also be translated into Greek soon. So my understanding is that they're beginning to work on that translation. I also asked Japan about their context because they translated STL. They also anticipate translating the standards for technological and engineering literacy, and they will broadcast those to all association members. So the new standard is currently considering how to translate it into Japanese. So they're anticipating translating the new standards. In Estonia, They had used STL as a text for teacher training. So again, the theme of the use of the standards in a teacher training context is common. They anticipate also translating the standards for technology and engineering literacy and for a similar use, so for teacher training as well. The comment was that the core disciplinary standards seem quite relevant to their context. They liked the illustration that appeared in the executive summary, which featured the STEL core disciplinary standards. So another country where the standards have been useful and will continue to be so. And Thailand, some STL standards were used in Thailand in their original curriculum development. The context in Thailand now has changed so that technology is now a part of the science curriculum. However, they anticipate they will review the new standards and compare them with an imminent updating of their curriculum. The ITEEA standard has been a useful source for Thailand's basic education curriculum. So in that context, mainly used for curriculum development. Okay, so that's an idea of how some of the countries are using the standards. I want to now think about some of the ways we might conceptualize the use of the standards. And rather than being judgmental in this presentation, I'm phrasing them in terms of questions that we might ask when international people, other countries are considering using the ITEA standards. We know that contextualization is important for effective learning. It's one of the fundamentals of teaching in many countries now. The content needs to be contextualized if students are to learn effectively. So the question to ask in relationship to the standards is, do they enable this or do they work against it? Do they enable the contextualization of the contexts that have been described for the states, or are they perceived as being deterministic? I think that's an important question. As we think about the current global challenges and what being technologically literate would mean for students, we can't help thinking about their relationship with some of the global challenges that we face today. For example, climate change, global food security, issues related to fake news, wealth inequity. These are some of the big issues. And to my mind, a question to be asked is using the standard, do using the standards enable that kind of critique for the big issues that are important for our time? So I think that's another question that can be asked. One of the differences, of course, between STL and STEL is the obvious inclusion of engineering. Now, for some countries, that's quite a foreign concept, that engineering would be formalized as an element of technology education. So as we saw in the case of Thailand, for example, that notion appeals to some countries, but I think it will be more of a foreign idea to other countries. Also, there's many countries around the world where the technologies, the historical technologies in schools have been amalgamated into technology education or design and technology, including what used to be home economics. Now, the standards for technological and engineering literacy do not cover those areas. So for those countries who have merged home economics and design and technology into an integrated technology curriculum, there may be some issues there in their use of the international standards. For example, areas like food technology, nutrition, health, personal finance, textiles and clothing, hospitality. I do note that some of those areas could well be included in the 8 contexts that are described within the curriculum. So I think it's a matter of perception and a matter of balance and emphasis in terms of the use of the standards in those contexts. I also note the focus in the standards and in the support material, a focus on the 6E lesson planning process. So my concern there was in terms of pedagogy, is it a little bit restrictive to focus on just one particular pedagogical approach? We would advocate teachers to use a range of pedagogies in their teaching. And while this comment I'm making now is not embedded within the standards, because it's implied in the support material, it may have a limited pedagogical outcome in some countries. So a couple of other issues to think about, I think, in relationship to, I can move that, I didn't realize. There, I can see all my text now. If we think about what knowledge is essential for technological literacy, we have to ask the question, is all the knowledge, all the practices, all the contexts, all the standards that are embedded in the STEL, are they all absolutely essential for a student to have technological literacy? So how does, and this isn't an issue just for the States, of course, this is an issue for many countries. If we prescribe essential knowledge, how do we relate that prescription to the notion of constant change? Also, if we say that technological literacy is an individual construct, so mine is different from yours, is different from your neighbours, different teachers have different levels of technological literacy and different notions of technological literacy. How do we align that variability with the idea that the standards must be achieved and the processes and contexts must be experienced in order to achieve technological literacy? I think that's a question, and I mentioned this in one of the early slides, that possible dichotomy between the flexibility of technological knowledge, the variability of technological literacy on an individual basis on one hand, and on the other hand, the prescription that this is essential in order to achieve technological literacy. I'm not sure how that balance works out. Another conception I wanted to frame a critique of the standards within is related to Indigenous technology. Arguably, the notion of Indigenous technology is important for the majority of the world's learners. Most of them are in developing countries. So the idea that learners are diverse, they construct knowledge from multiple perspectives which are meaningful to them is a fundamental of Indigenous technology. So students who don't have a sense of their own cultural identity may lack the skills for survival in their own community. Indigenous technology philosophy places the person at the centre. The human is not separate from nature, and the role of education is to transfer the cultural heritage of a society to the next generation. So the question in terms of this presentation and this topic is, is it possible to address issues related to Indigenous technology using the standards for technological and engineering literacy as a framework to do that? So again, I'm just posing the question here, and if we have time for some Q&A after, hopefully this will be one of the issues that we can discuss and raise. So in my conclusion, I think it's quite clear that the US standards for engineering and technological literacy have had an impact internationally. There are many similarities, as I've outlined just some of them, between the standards and the curriculum in other countries. Some of the differences may include the inclusion of engineering. Where does food and textiles fit? I know it can fit in some of the contexts that are described, but they're not explicit. So whether that's a difficulty for some countries might be an issue. And I think the organisation might be an issue as well, because any of you who have looked over a range of international curricula from different countries, it's always difficult to get to grips with how the curriculum is organised. Some have standards, some have goals, some have objectives at certain levels, some don't have levels, some have content specification, some have content areas. So the organisation of the US standards in terms of standards, contexts, and practices, if that doesn't align with another country's approach to technology education, then there may be some issues there. But of course, that doesn't mean, and from different countries, we've seen the evidence of countries using the standards for a range of different purposes. Some quite explicitly in curriculum development, some as a provision for teachers in teacher training. So there's many different ways in which the standards have been used, and quite valid approaches. So I think the use, as we look at how the standards have been used in different countries, I think it's quite consistent with a sort of a postmodern, post-colonial view of the integrity of local development. So there is no grand universal truth. What's important for a community is dictated by that community, not by another country. So I think the absence of statements in the standards that these are appropriate for everybody, everywhere, is a very positive recognition that postmodern views prevail in many countries, and allied with that, the use of the standards in particular countries reflects that idea that there is no universal truth. There is no one type of technological literacy. There is no one best technology education curriculum. So I think just to recap, that's been recognised largely in the standards, and it's also evident in the way the standards have been used. So I think the international applicability of the standards for technological and engineering literacy, which have only quite recently been released, will be quite useful in many countries as they have been in the past. So before I end, I'd just like to acknowledge these people from our ITEEA International STEM Centres who were kind enough to talk to me about the use of the standard in their particular centre. So thank you again for the opportunity to reflect on this. It was very interesting for me to delve quite deeply into the standards and then also try and place that in an international context. So I hope we can continue more discussion along these lines, either now if we have time, or in the future. I'd be very willing to discuss with anyone any of these issues, and my email is on the page on the screen. Okay, thank you very much. I look forward to meeting you again one day, but thank you again for the opportunity for this presentation.